When Doom and Doom 2 released onto Nintendo Game Boy Advance, they were hugely impressive ports. Nintendo's handheld console was not noted for its 3D prowess, and Doom was still under a decade old. Being able to take that experience on the go and play wherever you wanted was kind of a big deal, but these versions did come with their own shortcomings. None of these were deal breakers for these versions of Doom, but ultimately it did lead to a diminished experience that hasn't aged well over time. Fans of Doom don't like to let these things slide, and in the years since the game's released, fans have worked on creating their own port that corrects a lot of the shortcomings and offers a true look at what Nintendo's Game Boy Advance could have offered. Today we're going to push the limits of this fan port, play all the retail versions of Doom and even some custom WADs on real Game Boy hardware. All the footage you're about to see is being played from a Game Boy Advance flash cart through the GameCube's Game Boy player. I'm using Swiss and the custom Game Boy interface to capture this, and I will be playing Doom, Doom 2, TNT, Plutonia, John Romero's Sigil and some custom WADs. And welcome to GBA Doom. This is the ultimate Doom on Game Boy Advance, running on real hardware. It's important to stress that because running this in an emulator wouldn't give you a good idea of how this performs, and that'll become important later on in this video. As you can see, there are 4 episodes, which is one more than you get on the normal Game Boy Advance version of Doom. The iFlesh Consumed kind of pushes things a bit further in terms of performance. But you can see here, this is the original hangar. This is not the Jaguar version that is represented in the normal Game Boy Advance version of Doom. This is the full fat version of this level, and that's a theme throughout this version of Ultimate Doom. The fact is, this is pretty much the Doom experience unfiltered on Game Boy Advance, which you wouldn't think would be possible given how Game Boy Advance Doom sometimes pushes the limits itself, but ultimately this is running pretty great. Depending on the size of the rooms that we enter and the number of enemies on screen, things can sort of move up and down, but the target frame rate, from what I read in the development notes, is 35 frames a second. But this is a fork of PR Boom. This is not the full fat PR Boom though, so you can't sort of play all the limit removing WADs and things that you would maybe want to experience. That's largely because of limitations, obviously. I'm just taking a few seconds here to let you enjoy the ambience of this level. It still performs great even outside in this large space, and in the menus you can actually turn the graphic details from low to high. You'll struggle to see the difference here, so I'll do it again a bit later on when there's a bit more going on. Playing this with a GameCube controller is very, very strange, I have to say. The GameCube controller is not designed for the D-pad to be used extensively. It's not the best D-pad in the world. But so far, so good. It's down to personal taste if you prefer this version of the music that's implemented in this version or in the normal Game Boy Advance version. For me personally, I kind of prefer this version. As you can see, we're running through the level here, and there's the odd stutter here and there. That's to be kind of expected, but it's definitely playable. Definitely a good time here. I do think you could get through the whole of Ultimate Doom pretty easily with performance like this. I'll play through a bit of this level and then we'll jump onto Thy Flesh Consumed, because I think that's something that people are going to want to see. So there's a lot of monsters in this area, as well as it being quite a wide area. So let's see if the performance does hold up here. This is definitely comparable to the retail release of Doom 1 on Game Boy Advance. Controls are also pretty smooth. I'm using the B button to fire and I'm using the A to open doors. The shoulder buttons act as strafing, and you can turn on the map if you want to. I'll head outside here just to see if we can sort of push things along a little bit. But so far, this has been a very smooth experience. I would definitely not describe this as awkward. It does make you wonder if they'd had a bit more time to develop the original Game Boy Advance version of Doom, if they could have achieved something like this. With these normal levels. I have nothing against the Jaguar levels, they have their own charms and their own quirks, but there's definitely something to be said about experiencing the full version and the full unfiltered version of Doom 1. That imp there was just waiting behind the door for me. Thanks very much for that. I'm going to quickly jump ahead to the third level here just to show you this area in particular. There's a lot of enemies here, there's a lot of different varying heights in the floor, and as you can see, this version does a decent job of handling itself here. Except for my poor aiming skills when I'm trying to hit this pinky. Excuse me. There we go. But even in this big open space here, it's definitely not chugging along. I think you might have noticed there when I came inside the building here, the performance did jump ever so slightly, but that's to be expected because obviously smaller enclosed area. So I'm going to jump into Thy Flesh Consumed here. This is definitely one of the things that really intrigued me. This was left on the floor completely when it came to original retail Doom on Game Boy Advance, and there's a reason for that. There's some big levels in this episode and there's a lot of enemies, so this is a lot more demanding than the original 3 episodes in terms of size and scope. I am playing on I'm Tuned to Die here because I have a good feeling I would not make it through this level on the first attempt if I didn't. As we're moving around here as well, there's not really that much difference in performance. You would expect there to be some kind of like bump as we're kind of heading outside and heading inside, but it's not that bad. Although we've just woken all those enemies up, so we'll see how this transpires here. Take care of these imps. Ultimately though, what else can you say? This is the 4th episode of Ultimate Doom, which was not released onto Game Boy Advance, running on Game Boy Advance hardware. I'd argue about as well as you'd hope it to run. It's obviously not 60 frames a second, and it's obviously not going to win any visual awards, but again, you're playing on a Game Boy Advance screen, which has a very small resolution, so most of this on a normal Game Boy Advance screen would probably not even be noticeable. You can see in this opening room here that the large number of enemies and the large wide room here does create something of a stress on the performance. It's not game breaking by any stretch of the imagination, but it does kind of drop a few frames. Whether you'd notice that or not, sort of playing on an actual handheld, I don't know, but it's very noticeable when we're kind of looking at it on the big screen here. And that's something you have to remember with this. These games are not designed to be viewed in HD and 4K. That's what brings out the imperfections, because ultimately the Game Boy Advance screen is, I think it's 320 by 240, pixels. It's not even 480p. So a lot of these games are designed to go onto that screen, not to be blown up to 4K. Which is why everything has that sort of crispy look to it, but it wouldn't be a Game Boy Advance game if it wasn't crispy. Oh, so using the plasma rifle causes some lag as well. That's definitely interesting. I'm going to guess that's because of the sheer number of projectiles that show up on screen. Secrets still here. Can you imagine if they'd actually cut this level down, or this whole episode, Thy Flesh Consumed, for the Game Boy Advance? What kind of levels would we have ended up with? That's an interesting thought to ponder. But now we'll dive off into Doom 2. The interesting thing with Doom 2 on the Game Boy Advance is that I would argue it's a lot more ambitious than the original Doom on Game Boy Advance, just because it tries to offer a more unfiltered experience. As we start off here in Entryway, I'm just going to quickly show you the options menu here. You can make adjustments as and when you need. I'm going to make sure the graphic detail is set to high. You can see the difference as I'm changing there. Also going to put always run on because I don't want to be bashing run. We'll start again here and dive into the game. But yeah, in my opinion, Game Boy Advance Doom 2 really is a bit more ambitious because it tries to offer that full experience, but the compromises it takes to get there, in my opinion, do bring the experience down a few steps. Game Boy Advance Doom 2 has this really awful look to it, so textures in the distance just kind of bleed into each other and you end up with this really washed out, messy version of Doom 2 that looks quite ugly, especially when you sort of view it on a big screen. This, I'd argue, holds up a bit better. This is definitely looking better in my opinion. Also hope you're enjoying the Chipmunk Doom 2 soundtrack here. Game Boy Advance games have this very unique sound font, and you can definitely hear it in this version. Let's go through to the exit here. I don't want to end the level here, but I am going to grab some medkits. Excellent. There's not much to really say here. It's performing well. The performance isn't really a problem. Run out of ammo here. I'm going to quickly just show you the difference between the high graphics and the low graphics setting here. I think this is a good spot to do it because there's a lot of things here that you can kind of put your eyes on. So we'll go against this wall. Just keep an eye on the bodies there and the textures on the wall. That's what high detail looks like. It's not a huge difference, but I would be interested to test that out at some point to see if it actually does help performance when the game sort of starts chugging. I think the main thing with this is that it just kind of works. I would have to play deep into the game in order to sort of try out some of the bigger levels. Those would intrigue me a lot more than these small levels, just because I would be curious to see how the levels that got split in the original Doom 2 Game Boy Advance version handle as one whole unit. Industrial Zone, for example, I would be really keen to see how that is handled. and how that performs. From what I've read, performance can be a bit all over the place in some of the massive levels. Just take care of these enemies here. It does seem to be the size of the room and not the number of enemies that really hits performance. Big rooms tend to cause the issues rather than the number of enemies on screen, it seems. We'll take care of all the enemies inside this room here. And of course, if you're playing this version of Doom 2, at least you have an armor system that is fixed and works. I would argue that Doom 2 on Game Boy Advance is really kind of hurt in its late game by the fact that armor doesn't work properly and the whole system is just kind of broken. If you've never played the Game Boy Advance version of Doom 2, you will not understand how frustrating it is to have armor that actually doesn't do anything. See, things took a small step down there in terms of frames, but nothing too disastrous. Like I said earlier, from what I've read, this is a fork of PR Boom that has been kind of scaled back, so unfortunately any sort of limit removing WODs, you wouldn't really be able to get working on this. It's also nice to have shadows, because in Doom 2 Game Boy Advance, one of the worst things they do is they take all the lighting out of these sectors, so all of the sectors just end up looking really flat and well lit up, and it kind of takes a lot of the atmosphere out of these levels. That is Doom 2 in this version of Game Boy Advance Doom. So let's dive into some TNT Evolution here on the Game Boy Advance. The first thing you're going to notice is, yes, this is using Doom 2 music. I honestly couldn't tell you if that was a creative choice by the people that made these patches, if they couldn't get the music to work, I don't know. But it's just something that we're going to have to live with. But music aside, this is TNT on the Game Boy Advance. The big note about TNT and Plutonia obviously is that some of the levels in these games are massive. In particular TNT, some of its mid-levels and some of the levels towards the end are pretty hefty, and I'm fully confident that if I was to take us to those levels, which unfortunately I don't know any of the cheats for this version of Doom, I would expect those to be pretty much unplayable. Especially map 20. Map 20 is just a honking big map. But as you can see, we are definitely not missing out in these small levels here. Hit the switch there. Be careful for the chain gunners here. Grab the blue key. I'll head in here just to sort of explore the level a bit more fully. But much like with Doom 2, there's not much to really say, because when it works really, really well. Okay, I don't want to die this early here. And no, it's nothing to do with the controls being bad or anything like that. It's purely the fact that I'm not used to playing on this D-pad, and the GameCube D-pad is most definitely not the best way to experience Doom, let me tell you. It is weird to hear the Doom 2 music playing over TNT, I'm not gonna lie to you. It is pretty impressive to see this running on Game Boy Advance, purely because the only other place that this turned up around this time was on PS1, and let me tell you, the PS1 version of Final Doom, it has its own performance issues that even that hardware struggles with some of these levels. I might be tempted at some point to stream these games more fully and to do like a deeper exploration just to kind of see where the breaking point is in terms of performance. Human Barbecue is most definitely not one of my favourite TNT levels. It is interesting to ponder what changes they would have had to have made to all of these levels to get them to squeeze into a Game Boy Advance game, had this ever made it to retail. Speaking of not making it to retail, let's dive into Plutonia. Again, it has the same kind of issue going on where we've got to put up with the Doom 2 music. You can see that the distance textures, they're not super detailed, and obviously they do start to blur together, especially when it's like the ugly brown textures. Unfortunately, one of Plutonia's weaker aspects, in my opinion, is the fact that some of its texture work just kind of blends together, and you can kind of see that in this opening part here. There's just a lot of brown on screen, but you can see what's happening, and you do have an idea of what's going on, so I guess at least we can do that. I cannot imagine if the Doom 2 Game Boy Advance retail version was doing this. This would be a smudge, I'm just telling you. The level I'd be most curious to try on this version of Doom is most definitely Go To It, level 32, which is the secret one, just because the sheer number of enemies on that level, I would love to see how that would turn out. Once again, this is very playable. I did wisely choose not to play on ultraviolence for this, just because Plutonia has a lot of enemies on all of its difficulty settings anyway. It doesn't really matter if the easy enemies or the not so easy enemies for the purposes of this showcase. There's also one little gloat that this version of Doom can have over the PS1 version of Final Doom, because the PS1 version of Final Doom doesn't have art files in it, but this one does. In fact, interestingly, the Game Boy Advance version of Doom 2 that was released to retail has art files in it as well. We're really letting the auto aim do the heavy lifting for us there. There is the art file. Excellent. As we make our way through here, we get to kill the brawny boy as he pops up there. Hit the switch. I think a trapdoor opens up behind us there. I could let that Pain Elemental flood this room with lost souls and see how that affects things, but I don't think I'd live long enough to tell that tale. Although it's doing a good job there of putting lost souls into the level, so maybe I should just let it do its job. So if this was all there was to this Game Boy Advance Doom package, I'd be very impressed. Seeing Final Doom running on Game Boy Advance is very impressive as it is, but this isn't where the story ends, because you can run Sigil. Yes, John Romero's Sigil can also make its way over to Game Boy Advance. We're definitely going on I'm Too Young to Die here. So it's interesting, this one, because it takes over the third episode slot, so it ends up with the Inferno music. It's also worth noting that some of these more complex sort of structures, as you can see behind us, really do hurt the performance here. I think this is the first time in anything that I've played where I would say this is almost unplayable. There's a lot of complex sort of sector work going on over there, and you can see that the Game Boy Advance is not loving this. It's definitely not loving this at all. We can carry on. There's definitely nothing stopping us from pushing this further. But as I mentioned earlier on, I think that what really chugs this version down isn't enemies, because I think that it can handle a lot of enemies on screen. I think the problem is that there's just a lot of complex work going into rendering this level, because the thing with Sigil is that some of these levels are huge. This definitely isn't unplayable though, and especially when you're kind of not in the big areas. And you can finish these levels, so obviously we're going to head to the exit here. I'm not going to bother going for the secrets. The next level is going to interest me, because I know the next level is pretty hefty in terms of size. Okay, there we go. You can see, looking out onto this, it's not having the best time here. And as I mentioned on the last level, I suspect that's because this is a very big level. What Sigil does that other Doom games don't tend to do is a lot of these levels are kind of enclosed in giant caverns. As you can see the outside of the level over there. I think we may have found the theoretical limit here, and you can also see there's some graphical glitches going on around those candles to the left and right there. Oof. Okay, this is almost unplayable. I would not say it's impossible. We could probably push through this, but this is definitely a sort of, yeah, that was going to happen there. Unfortunately, I think complex levels like this are very much the reason why you ended up with the Jaguar levels in the first place. And when you don't sort of reduce the number of sectors, it puts a lot of pressure on the game, and this is what happens when that pressure has nowhere to go. You get performance that I feel like is close to single digits. Try as it might, the Game Boy Advance is not really designed for this kind of complexity. But this is not the end of our little adventure here, because we are going to dive into some custom WADs. when I was doing my research into this port and trying to understand it, I actually came across someone who was actually converting WADs over to a format that is compatible with the Game Boy Advance version of Doom here. And I definitely had to give it a try. I didn't expect this to work, but as you can see, performance-wise, this is pretty great. Of course, I don't know if it would have the kind of problems that Sigil would have if the things got complex, but it can't be understated just how impressive it is to see custom WADs working at all on actual Game Boy Advance hardware. It's one thing to put it into an emulator, it's another thing to get this working on hardware, and the Doom community really needs to be given a pat on the back for pushing things this far. And this isn't even like a project, like this is playable. This is really, really impressive. It's kind of crazy to me that this is even possible, let alone, you know, to this level, and this is very polished. We'll go into the second level here. I probably won't play this one all the way through. You can see that this is running great. It looks great as well. Let's take out this imp here. Unfortunately, I didn't grab any decent weapons, so this is going to be a rough end to this level. I think before I wrap up here, I'm going to show off just one more custom level set, and this is Memento Mori. This is from 1996. This is actually one of my favourite WADs from way back in the day, and again, you can see it just works. I thought there was an enemy there, it was actually a candle. Never in my life did I feel I would be playing this WAD on a Game Boy Advance, but here we are doing it right now. And before anyone asks, unfortunately there is not a version of Nuts. Hilarious as that would be, it would probably be the most unworkable level I can imagine on this version of Doom. Honestly though, I'm very, very impressed by what I've seen here. Playing through these has been really, really fun, and I am very, very tempted to do a full walkthrough, in particular of Doom 1 and Doom 2, and maybe Final Doom, just because I would like to see how far we can get into those games, just to see like how it does handle the bigger levels, and if it really does get that bad performance-wise. You can see there's a slight drop in performance here because that back wall has opened up and there is a lot going on. I am gonna die here. Grab the stim pack there. As we head outside here, it's not really that bad performance-wise, actually. I was expecting things to go a bit worse than this. There's a lot of enemies here, there's quite a bit of geometry around, but it seems to be handling things pretty well. The only thing I will say is that the fact that this is going to be on a Game Boy Advance screen, if you were playing this on a handheld, you probably wouldn't be able to see enemies in the distance because everything gets really, really small in the distance. Really, really, really small. It does go to show you though that on Game Boy Advance there was a lot of potential left on the table, and while what we got was nice and fun and interesting for the time, it does show that with more time and care there was definitely a lot more room for a better experience across the two Game Boy Advance Doom games. In terms of this version of Doom, I am considering very strongly doing a full playthrough of potentially Ultimate Doom and Doom 2 in this format, if people would like to see that, or if they want to see a video on how I got all this to work. The process of getting this to work and all these WADs to work was quite involved, but I am definitely happy to share the resources to help people to experience this as well, because In my opinion, this is very much worth experiencing. Let me know what you thought of this. Do you like this port of Doom? Do you prefer it to the retail versions that we got? Let me know in the comments, and thank you so much for watching.